Addiction never affects just the addict. It affects all of us. Recovering from addiction and alcoholism is also a life-changing battle for families dealing with a loved one's addiction. Numerous programs support addicts as they reclaim their lives, while their families face their own challenges without the same guidance. You're listening to Voices in Courage with KL Wells, where we transform the lives of the families and loved ones of addicts and alcoholics from surviving to thriving in the midst of chaos. Tune in as we highlight vulnerable stories of families who have addicted relatives and friends and learn how they have dealt with the challenges of isolation, desperation, and shame. If you are seeking ways to live your best life, then we welcome you into this safe space. Be a part of change today with your host, KL Wells.
Hello, everybody. This is Voices in Courage with KL Wells. And my guest this week is Tucker Stein. We've been throwing around the ideas about what are the things that people most want to know about related to addiction, alcoholism, how the family navigates. And one of the things that just keeps coming up consistently over the year and a half that we've been doing this podcast is understanding what's going on in the mind of an addict. Through addiction mode, recovery mode, and then potentially rewiring the mind from thoughts and pathways that don't serve to thoughts and pathways that do serve. And so I thought, well, who better to talk to today than my compadre and colleague in this whole movement that we've created here for families and friends of the loved ones of addiction and addicts. And so what I want you to do, Tucker, to help us out, to help us understand is kind of stepping back into that time when you were in the throes of your own addiction and what contributed to that. And then the progress of how your beliefs and how your thought patterns began to shift. And then we'll get to the DBT towards the end.
Sure. Well, I might know just a little bit about this subject, so I'm happy to share it. But it's evolved definitely over the last 8 years since being sober, and you're constantly learning. And we know this about, vigilant learning and getting to know why this all happened, because I do reflect back and go, how the did this happen? And, for those of you who have not heard the story, I didn't grow up abusing alcohol. I didn't have issues with alcohol. It wasn't until really around the age of 38 or so that I was finally diagnosed with acute adult onset alcohol abuse disorder. It's long, but for me, growing up in the 70s and 80s, mental health was never talked about. And for me, I knew from day one, all the way probably dating back to kindergarten, when I hid underneath the piano the first day of kindergarten, and my teacher had to constantly pull me out, that I had a level of anxiety that I didn't know what was going on. It progressed. It was triggered at certain times, not necessarily social anxiety, but just this feeling of just being antsy in my own body. And over time, you don't even think about it, right? It just happens. Oh, it's part of me. I'm sure everybody else goes through that. But as you go and you get later on in life and you have more responsibility and there's fears around financial security, dealing with, making sure your marriage is healthy and raising the kids and all of these things as a provider for me was a constant pressure on my chest. And the anxiety really just overcame me. It was literally driving all of my decisions. And I didn't know how to communicate how I was feeling, because at the end of the day, it's like, okay, well, I didn't have a traumatic childhood. I didn't have the signs of what people would normally consider alcohol abuse. But what I did know to be true, that alcohol was the only thing that soothed the anxiety. And in my mind, it's like, great, I've got something that does it. I don't have to go on medication. I don't have to tell anybody. And I can live a normal life until it's not normal anymore. And what ended up happening was my brain kept absorbing, literally and figuratively, a solution that allowed me not to think anymore. And it worked for quite some time until my brain finally said, this is all I know to be true. And if I don't have the liquid solution, I can't function right. I didn't see it coming. I didn't realize that would be an issue. I never had the alcoholic gene growing up. So to me, it was just I've got an anxiety issue, but I found a solution. And it wasn't until it was way too late that I thought, okay, this isn't normal anymore. And actually, as a depressant, it made me even more anxious. And then my body started to reject. My brain was shutting down and my body was rejecting. And then I thought, okay, this is a physiological thing now, not just a, emotional, mental thing. It's now physiological. And that's when I said, okay, something's got to change. Uh, and it doesn't work for everyone in terms of saying, okay, I have a problem and I need to get it fixed. For many, it's like, that's all I see. And our brain becomes, at some point, they call it wet brain. Our brain becomes so detached from how we should physically feel and act and connect. The synapses are just broken. I mean, it's just everything is broken. And unfortunately, when you're inside the mind, you don't see it. Everybody else around you can see it. But the person standing there and feeling it's like, what's your problem? I don't have a problem. It's I'm still functioning. What do you mean? And that's when you start to realize, and for me, when I finally got sober, it is a disease of the brain. It's not a disease of drinking. I didn't even like doing it, but I didn't like feeling even more. And that was what was
Could you
driving it.
just say that one more time? Because
Yeah.
I think this is to some extent the crux of this whole thing.
Yeah. I didn't even like the drinking part. I didn't like the self-medicating, the coping that I had, but I disliked feeling what I was feeling way
Mm-hmm.
more.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it was the lesser of two evils until it flipped and I didn't see it coming.
Right, right. And so what I have learned about the addict's brain through one of the videos that we have listed as a resource, which cannot is not coming to mind right now, is that the drug of choice takes the first position in
Yeah.
our brains relative to surviving. So we're not eating well, relationships fall away. We're self-destructing our life around us because it has superseded everything else.
Absolutely. And it's not unique to addiction per se when it comes to drugs and alcohol. Oftentimes we kind of categorize when you hear addiction, drugs and alcohol is like the thing. But when I went into treatment, I had friends that were in sex addiction. I mean, same thing. It was a mindset disease, and they didn't see it affecting everybody else around them. I'm getting away with it, but I'm not seeing that it's affecting all of my relationships. Same thing with exercise. It's all the same kind of disease, but we're responding to the stimuli in different ways.
Yeah.
And that's where the narrative needs to change around why. Because when we hear, oh, addiction isn't a choice, it's a disease, you're only seeing the symptoms, right? You're not actually seeing the disease itself.
Right.
It's a hidden disease. Like you can't see mine. Sometimes I can't even see mine. And that's what's leading me to kind of understanding and the moment that you can love your brain, understand your brain, and really get a clear picture, clarity around what's happening, then you can start to actually make the changes. Stopping drinking, you can even ask my wife and family this one. Stopping drinking is not healing. It's not. It's just the beginning of having to rewire everything. And they tell you once you're treating yourself, you've been abusing your body for so long, it takes 9 months for your brain to actually get back into a cycle where it needs to be. 9 months is a long time.
Yeah.
And
Well,
most
I mean,
people just assume it's a quick fix.
yeah, no. And that's, I think, one of the major myths around this. I mean, and the school of thought right now is 16 months for drugs.
Yeah.
And so the brain has been so co-opted and diseased that stopping the substance abuse, whatever that is, but also stopping like sex addiction, shopaholism. I mean, Dr. Gabor Mehta, who is arguably one of the world's renowned people in the drug abuse space, talked about his own addiction to classical music,
Yeah.
which was acceptable.
Mhm.
you
Right.
know so in the workaholism is an addiction, and gambling is an addiction. So we have there's a whole big bucket of addictions. When it takes over your life, which means it has taken over the number one position in your brain as the thing you need in order to survive, then it has taken over your life and you're out of control.
The coping is the coping is different. The consequences are different.
Hmm.
But where your brain is at is universal. And
Yes.
that's the biggest problem. And
Right.
we don't teach it. We don't
Hmm.
we don't experience, we don't share it. It just
Hmm.
becomes this kind of mythical thing.
Hmm.
We're doing all the other things around, cancer and autoimmune and all of these other kinds of diseases, but we're not giving ourselves the education on our brain, which literally physiological, emotional, all of the things that drive who we are as humans, we're ignoring.
Right. And so, you know, once your brain starts to kind of begin to heal, and let's say, you're in 8 years at this point of quote not drinking, and your brain's had time to do some healing. I think generally speaking, my take on things is that our brains are always in a mode of healing. I think they're layered experiences of our brains healing.
Yeah.
So with yours in particular, you had patterns of thought
Mhm.
around anxiety, a
Mhm.
sensitivity that was almost kinesthetic in
Yeah.
you around anxiety. And so what do you know now in terms of kind of rewiring the thoughts
Yeah.
in a serving way, rewiring the chemistry or the kineticness of the anxiety to actually being more in peace and calm,
Mhm.
more often than in anxiety.
Yeah. For me, and again, this is now 8 years of the journey. And I think it's important for families to understand this in terms of, there's one journey that ends with going into sobriety, and then a whole nother journey, as my wife will say, learning a new dance. There's a whole new journey that begins, and there are phases and stages. And that first stage is grace, giving yourself the ability to feel again, giving yourself the ability to just kind of gather yourself. Think about where you want to go. Think about and reflect upon where you've been, making sure that you are literally in um, a space of not falling back into where you were before. You're still in a bit of that survival mode. Survival mode doesn't end with stopping to drink. You're in that relapse prevention plan. You're doing all the things that you're supposed to do, and you're starting to feel a little bit better, but up here isn't changing enough, and it's frustrating. Medication helps, that sort of thing. And then as you move into that, it's like, okay, let's do the therapy. Let's get into talking about it more. Let's get into marriage therapy or family therapy, and for everybody, it's different. But at the end of the day, it's one thing to get the thoughts and emotions out of your body, but getting your thoughts and emotions out of your body does not change behavior. Behavioral change is necessary for rewiring the brain and for living a healthy, sober life. It's just bottom line. And again, the behavior of not drinking for me was not enough, because all I'm doing is reverting back to my younger teenage, young adult self when all that anxiety starts to pile up. So as we got through therapy and realized, I remember my therapist finally saying, "You know what? You've gotten to a point where you've taken accountability, you've taken responsibility, yet there are still things that you're doing that are damaging relationships. Um, I'm still hurting myself to a certain degree, right? There's that shame and guilt and forgiveness that still kind of go like this. But there's also behaviors that you have with your loved ones. And it's not a reflection of the loved one.
Mhm.
It's a reflection of the behavior still not being able to change. So what I was really excited about, and I know this is kind of where we're leading the conversation, was my therapist recommended DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy. I tested a little bit of it in treatment, but your brain isn't ready to attack it yet. And what this is being able to identify the triggers, identify the feelings, identify all of the emotions that take you down the path of old behavior, and literally saying, nope, we're changing that. We're going to give you the skills and the tools that you need to literally stop, which is one of the skills, stop the behavior, rethink about how you're going to respond to certain situations, distress tolerance, emotional regulation. We call it the RIDS in treatment, restlessness, irritability, and discontent. All of those emotions that typically come with someone who's struggled in the past. How do you fix that? Because here it goes again, right? Our old behavior was escape, avoid, soothe, medicate, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now it's like you got to feel a hell of a lot harder. And DBT allows you to build these skills where you can literally sense it coming. And one of them is coping ahead. You sense it coming, you know what's going to happen. So what are you going to do differently? And then after, I'm in month 3, I realize now all of a sudden what I used to do, thank God, is finally changing. And my brain is starting to take the maladaptive behaviors and create healthy new ones. So that what I should have been doing 10 years ago, I'm now doing now. And your brain does have the ability to reprogram itself. That's the beauty of it. Um, so the DBT and this kind of therapy, I didn't realize how much of my success was going to be based on behavior and brain-based thinking.
Mhm.
I thought it was really all about the drink.
Right, right. And so I think that's a myth that most people carry, is that it's about the alcoholism, or
Mhm.
the drink, the drugs, the shopping, the sex, the whatever it is. And that's just the coping mechanism to stop the pain. And so then you strip that away. Well, then you're still left with the pain or the anxiety or the, "Oh, whoa, I don't feel good in my own body." Then what do you do? And I think we live in an extraordinary time right now where we have so much research around rewiring our brains,
Mhm.
that we know that we can heal,
Yeah.
and it takes repetition, 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 repetition to rewire when we've been wiring for decades a
Right.
certain pattern.
Yeah.
So it doesn't happen overnight. um,
One of my favorite quotes that I use all the time now, even with clients, and is a poet named philosopher Hafiz, who says, "The words you speak become the house you live in." And that literally became my house, right? So you think about it in that sense, what are the words that you're going to be saying now that are going to determine the house? And for a long time, even in sobriety, the words that were coming out of my mouth were not the house that I wanted to live in. So it's like, okay, you got to sell that house and go buy a new one. And what are you going to do to make sure that it's not the same old, fixer upper that it was before? And this somewhat controversial, but I bring this up and I've talked about it a lot with friends that are in recovery. I've always had a problem that after a certain period, if you're going to go to a meeting and you have to introduce yourself every single time as an alcoholic, um, when individuals, beat cancer, they don't still say that they have cancer. They don't say they're a cancer patient. They may say they're in remission, but they don't allude to the fact that they have it anymore. The problem is if the words you speak become the house you live in and you're constantly saying, I am this, your brain is not able to cope with the fact you're bringing yourself back into an old house. And I know it's very controversial. And if you ask any of, a sponsor, they'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't, how can you say that? But for me, that's what I had to change part of the behavior. You still surround yourself with the right people, but you gotta be careful how you're telling your brain to act,
right,
and that's a
right.
behavior. And sometimes it's just simple words that create a huge behavioral difference.
Absolutely. I mean, words matter. Just the shift between using the judgment
Mhm.
word to the discernment word is emotionally charged versus not.
Yeah.
And we talked about this with Mary Beth O'Connor in the woman who wrote From Junkie to Judge a
Yeah.
couple times,
Right.
and she paid attention to the things in her treatment in these various areas that worked for her
Yeah.
and let the other things go.
Yeah.
So she created, kind of a hybrid um, treatment plan for herself that would lift her into consistent decades of recovery.
Yeah.
And so we talk about this is we're not giving you advice.
Mhm.
We're
Yeah.
giving you options.
Yeah. It's simply stories that inform, you know, supporting you.
Yes. And so this is Tucker's journey. I
Mhm.
have a different journey with my son. But there are some truths that I think are inherent.
Yes.
And one is that a lot of addiction is trauma based
Mhm.
and driven by what Dr. Gabor Mate would talk about as hungry ghosts
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
we, to some extent, become unaware of, that they're actually running in the background,
Yeah.
and they have actually kind of hijacked us. Um, and so there's a lot of layers to reveal what's
Yeah.
really going on,
Yeah.
and then the notion that our brains can heal,
Yes.
and that we can rewire them for thriving, for healthy um, thoughts, for healthy behaviors, for healthy relationships, for a healthy, thriving life.
Yeah. I the other thing that and we talked a little bit about this in treatment, and again, this kind of comes from the inside the mind of an alcoholic addict. You don't tell a blind person, why can't you see? Um, it's the same thing. I don't know how to explain it, but when you're active, you are completely blind to the world. So the ability to say, why can't you just stop? Why can't you see what you're doing? The vision, the sight of everything might as well be completely black. And that is such a hard realization. And sometimes, they call them rock bottoms or whatever it is. And sometimes it takes someone to hit you over the head or an event that's really detrimental for you to start to see again. But you might as well be blind when you're in that active space. It is so difficult to express, but there is absolutely no sight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But your brain is in charge of sight, right? So when you get to reprogram your brain and clarity becomes it, I mean, there's so much clarity around sight again. And you go back and you do a reflective, retrospect of sight back, you start to see what you couldn't before. Um, yeah, and it's
Well,
it's
it's fascinating, and I know from some of the work that I do is there's this messy middle, you know, of who you used to be and who you're becoming.
yeah,
And I just had this happen with one of my clients where they were moving towards who they're becoming, and their brain started to try and take them back again.
yeah,
And it became this kind of wrestling between the old patterns of thought and behavior with the new thoughts of pattern behavior. And of course, I was able to say to him, you're in this messy space. This is how it rolls. And so you know where you're going, you know who at the heart of who you really are is. Just understand that your brain is still trying to take you back to the old. That's all that's happening here. So we're
yeah,
going to override it. And we know how to override the system because you know enough to know that's who you really are and that's who you really want to be. And so that took about a month of messy middle for him.
mhm,
And then the next time I saw him, he was like, I'm good.
yeah.
Like, awesome.
Yeah. Well, and it's weird again, having to know your brain, your brain obviously it protects you from fear. or danger, and it seeks
Change.
comfort. Yeah, change.
Change.
It seeks comfort, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if
Mm-hmm.
your comfort, you've trained your brain that comfort is in this space of escape and numbing everything out.
Mm-hmm.
Great, it's protecting me
Mm-hmm.
until it can no longer protect you. And then
Mm-hmm.
this idea of reprogramming your brain to be safe and comfortable over here
Mm-hmm.
is a really, really tough process.
Mm-hmm.
A ton of work.
It's
It
a
is
journey.
really, really hard. But what I'm finding now, and I didn't think about this, but therapy isn't enough. Behavior is what drives a healthy, sober life. Behavior changes family dynamics. And until you can get to that point where behavior is changing everything, forget it. The first thing they ask in DBT is, what are your life goals? What are your life worth living goals? And for me, first and foremost, I said, a healthy marriage, making sure that my wife is good, making sure that my wife is protected, making sure that we're getting back to where we used to be. My kids, making sure that they understand the trust, right? And that we're still a family unit and you can still see where dad is today. Financial security, realizing that my mindset of scarcity and fear was never going to lead to abundance. And I was never bringing the right energy to the table. And to be able to diminish anxiety, and I'm starting to see as I'm going through this process, behavior is driving all of those goals. And it requires a certain, now, DBT isn't going to work for everyone. I just wanted to share that experience, both to talk about inside the mind of an alcoholic, but also what are those aha moments that families can start to lean on and see and get excited about that ultimately change the dynamic.
Yes. And there's the flip side of this too, is I've had to do my own reworking of my brain
Yep.
in terms of my belief previously, this was years ago, was that I needed to fix this.
Mhm.
It's not mine to fix.
Yeah.
And changing the patterns of behavior around that was part of my work.
Yep.
Um, when I stood on a sidewalk and watched Sam get arrested, I felt like my life was
Yeah.
actually just completely imploding and falling
Yep.
apart.
Yep.
Well, I needed to flip the script on that one too, because in fact, my life was beginning to fall together.
Yep.
And so to be able to hold on to the counterweights of thinking that
Yep.
actually serve you in thriving, and then just drive those thoughts of thriving deeper and deeper and deeper, that's our rewiring.
Yep.
And so we have our own work to do as loved ones.
And it's true. My wife and I have discussed this. It's being in that fear response for so long,
Mm-hmm.
that's its own, your brain is creating its own comfort system, right?
Right.
So what I love
Right.
about the DBT is it's somewhat contagious.
Mm-hmm.
So it allows and giving an invitation and hopefully soothing the maladaptive behaviors everyone's kind of been experiencing and
Right.
exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and ultimately, I would go back to the words we speak become the house we live in, making sure the words that I speak to my loved ones create the house that we want to live in.
Mm-hmm.
And that is success. Uh,
Yes.
and if you were to tell me that 8 years ago, I would have been like, what are you talking about? House is
Mm-hmm.
fine. I got a house.
Mm-hmm. Right, 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 right. Well, and I want to kind of exclamation point. It's not just what we say to others, it's also what we say to ourselves. Because, in the
Yeah.
world that I live in terms of executive coaching, there are a lot of executives that are massively beating themselves up in terms of negative thought patterns, imposter syndrome, so on and so forth, that needs rewiring, retooling.
Yeah.
And so I'm super clear at this stage, no matter what Sam's doing in his recovery, my recovery is about being as healthy and thriving as I possibly can from a mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical perspective, so that if he pops out the other side,
Yep.
a thriving parent is
Yep.
there to meet him.
Yep. Yep.
And what I would say to those of you who are listening right now is the work is really never done because there's layers of consciousness that continue to reveal themselves to me. And so it's not a one and done, just like it's not, oh, would you just stop drinking and then everything will be fine? That is
Yep.
completely erroneous.
Yep.
And so if I just think one great thought, then I'll just be fine. It's
Yep.
just not how life rolls. So awareness, super, super important. Pausing, being clear about what you want to say to yourself, to others, who you want to be with yourself, with others. It's causing us to rethink what it actually means to be human.
Yep. Absolutely. And giving yourself grace and patience and
Hmm.
understanding that this is still part of the journey.
Hmm.
A couple sessions aren't going to make a difference,
Hmm.
but you got to make it part of your lifestyle. And
Hmm.
those habits and those behaviors determine everything. So
Hmm.
I'm really glad we had this conversation today. It's been on my
Hmm.
mind, and
Hmm.
being able to share the learning. And to me, this is one of those proud moments for myself because I can finally say I'm getting over the hump on a lot of things.
Hmm.
And I'm hope I'm making my family proud. But it's something that I wanted to share on the inside, so
Hmm.
that families and loved ones can understand a little bit more about how their loved one might be feeling.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I'm proud of you. I mean, this is courageous work. It's courageous work for you. It's courageous work for me. So both sides of the aisle, people. Um, it takes courage to look at what we're thinking and how we're behaving and change it.
Yep, that's why we're here.
Hmm. Exactly. So voices and courage.
Thanks for having me, Kale. Good to see you again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tucker, for being here.
Thank you for joining us in this episode. We hope this discussion gives you the empowerment you need during these challenging times. Remember, there is always light after darkness. For more inspiring conversations like this one, subscribe to the show at voicesencourage.com/podcast. We encourage you to share with your friends and family going through similar situations so we can continue to build a strong community of hope and possibility. Start your life-changing journey today. Join our community at voicesencourage.com.